Hello and welcome to the Analysys Mason podcast. I'm Caroline Gabriel. I'm a research partner at Analysys Mason, and today I'm here with Alessandro Ravagnolo to discuss what 6G may mean for towercos.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you for having me here. Yeah. Alessandro Ravagnolo, I'm a managing partner in the London office at Analysys Mason, and indeed I have a lot of things to do, right, with 6G, wireless infrastructure, and then, right, the Venn diagram between them. What does 6G means for wireless infrastructure companies, their investors? In particular, of course, we're talking about what does it mean for mobile towercos. By the way, it's great. It's the first podcast we're doing. Actually, I'm doing in these new settings. It's so professional here. It's really amazing, right? So we have these amazing mics. We have the lights. So you look like real professional podcasters.
I
today,
know,
right? It's
really
going to be great.
exciting.
We're going to be a fan. So yes. So while we're here, then it's 2026. It's almost effectively that time of decades where we need to start thinking about the next decade, right? It feels yesterday, 20 years ago, people in the room were discussing about what 4G meant, right? Getting out of 3G. I do remember 10 years ago, more or less, at this point in decades, start discussing about what 5G, these great things that were supposed to be 5G meant for telcos, but also for the towercos. And here we are again. We need to kind of talk it again about 6G and what does it mean, right? It's very exciting because, let's be honest, at this stage, nobody knows. Or better, we can have some idea, we can start speculate. We would say that we can take some educated guesses, I presume. And why we need to talk about it now? It's because whenever we talk on infrastructure, it's very important that we always take, right, a long-term view. The business case for investing into infrastructure is always predicated on very long-term business plan, 10 years at least, but ideally also 20, 30 years. So terminal values are very important when creating a business case for investor to put money, right, to fund wireless infrastructure. And therefore, when it comes to towercos, it's also very important that themselves, right, have a long-term view on what does it mean for them. So happy to discuss about that. So I think it's very exciting because we have different perspectives, right? We come from, we can look at the topic from different angles, and I very look forward to hear your view about it.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to have those different perspectives. I'm perhaps coming more from the point of view of the technology and the evolution of the network itself. And you're right, it's exciting, Ali, but I can also sense there's probably some people kind of sighing out there in the audience and think, yeah, 10 years ago, we had all this excitement around 5G, and really how much is that has happened? So I think it's important we look at what really came true with 5G. Or maybe it's the old legend of the mobile industry that it's the even-numbered generations that are important.
Totally true.
3G was not such a big success. 4G was really a big requirement from the industry, drove a lot of change on the infrastructure side as well as on the network side. 5G is still playing out. And as you say, for infrastructure, you need this long-term view. And yet in the mobile industry, it's really hard to get that long-term view. Every 10 years, there's a new cycle, whereas you'd like the underlying infrastructure to be multiple decades. So I think an important conversation around 6G is how do we align those two cycles? And, the operators don't necessarily want to deploy a new network every 10 years. And the towercos, I'm sure, probably, want to make sure that they have a long-term view on their assets. So I think that's one of the things that's important to talk about today. But on the other hand, 6G has to be different, otherwise there's no point talking about it. So I think that's what we should say today. Is 6G going to just evolve from 5G, or is it going to be something new that perhaps makes up for the shortcomings of 5G, and what does that mean for tower operators?
And I think that the audience today needs to expect us to mention 5G a lot, even though the podcast is about 6G. It's because, of course, the best way to understand 6G is to understand how different it is from 5G as an evolution. But let's be honest, let's also all make an effort to look back at 10 years ago, what we were expecting for 5G, and basically learn from what actually happened, right? Because that's the best indication about what could happen on 6G or not. To be discussed today, right? And the reason is, there are many people going around the industry 10 years ago talking about 5G will create such a magic upsides, right, for the whole industry, be it telcos, for towercos. So it was kind of a point of bifurcation in the industry where finally the golden era is upon us, right? I think we can all agree that was not necessarily the case, but especially for the towerco point of view, right? There was kind of an expectation, okay, 5G will drive multiple upside from a revenue point of view. There was not a lot of clarity about how antennas will look like for 5G because we were moving from passive antenna to active antennas. So effectively, you might have heard the term massive MIMO, which is this big panel antenna, meaning they have actually a lot of active component into it. So multiple beams, small antennas into it. Nobody knew right at the time how this will shape out. At some point, somebody talked to me, I mean, Tauco will have a massive business case because we're going to see these garage size antennas being deployed to support this new technology, which will trigger additional revenue because at the end of the day, a towerco contracts, right, with the operators, often based on term of not just number of units that go into the vertical segment, but also amount of weight or amount of space that a tenant, so a mobile operators, occupy onto the tower.
Yeah, and I think it's really important bringing up massive MIMO because I think it's a great example of how at the start of 5G we made assumptions about the infrastructure that then got changed. So I think I can remember say 10, 12 years ago, people were talking about active antennas but thought they were quite far away. And all the focus on the planning of 5G was, it's going to be much more dense and we're going to get 5G has to deliver more capacity, and we're going to do it with small cells, with clusters of small cells. I can remember a lot of conversation that 5G would be small cell first. And then, of course, the exact opposite happens. Most operators deployed more or less on their existing site grid. They came up with the 5G non-standalone, which was a much less radical change in the network anyway. Plus, I think the active antenna and the massive MIMO technology accelerated in the development but it got smaller and lighter. So we ended up with roughly the same grid, far fewer small cells than we thought, a lot more active antennas. And of course, all of those have implications for the tower operators.
Yeah, you mentioned small cells, right? So I cannot not mention that. I think the first time I heard small cells were in 2010. And I remember we were saying, okay, we are 5 years from a massive scale deployment of small cell. People were talking about 10, 15, even 15, somebody argued, right? Small cells for macro cell. Don't get me wrong. Then in 2015, the discussion was exactly the same. We're still 5 years from it. Saying it was 2020, we are 5 years from it, right? It's 2025, actually 2026, we are 5 years from it.
Yes, exactly.
Don't get me wrong, we are seeing some small cell deployments, but in far smaller numbers, as you correctly suggested than before, right? The economic small cells have always been challenging, let's be honest. And that's why probably has never been really the top priority, right, for operators in terms of they prefer to upgrade existing macro cell than small cell. I wonder is going to be the same for 6G?
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because when we're talking outdoors, I think when we talk indoor small cells, that's a different issue. But when we're thinking about outdoors, a lot of the conversation around the 6G topology is that rather than doing a huge nationwide upgrade again to increase capacity in 6G, actually 5G capacity for most operators is sufficient, except in certain locations. And that's going to be, I believe, intensified by the rising use of AI, which is something we didn't take into consideration at the start of 5G. AI, is moving towards training, towards inferencing. A lot of that is done near the edge. A lot of that just requires not sending loads of data traffic across the long distance network, but having it all transmitted and processed in quite small hotspots. So I think we are looking at an architecture where capacity upgrade will be much more location specific than it's been in 4G, 5G. Doesn't necessarily mean small cells, but it means, I think, in terms of an infrastructure company, thinking, what are going to be those pots of gold, those infrastructure locations, if it's a city centre or a business area, whatever it is, that AI is going to drive to be super valuable. And of course, that links to the investment in data centres.
Okay, makes sense. maybe we mentioned a few things about 6G, right? AI is certainly one of the feature, but can you maybe explain how 6G will look like and how it differ from 5G?
Yes. Well, I can't in detail because we have not yet started really on the standardization process for 6G. That will be 3GPP. We will still be producing the core standards that underpin all this. Release 20 is the crossover between 5G and 6G. That's quite significant. They are referring to it as a crossover, which suggests that it will be an evolution. In some ways, there'll be compatibility between the two rather than a brand new start. So I think that's an important thing to know. But we have very little visibility at the minute on exactly what those standards include. But there's a lot of assumptions that more or less the industry has agreed on. One is that AI should be baked into the network as deeply as possible, to make it far more automated and intelligent, to allow traffic to flow more efficiently. So it's all about intelligence more than huge amounts of extra capacity. But a lot of what we hear about 6G is actually being innovated, of course, by the big telco vendors and operators, but also from the cloud and IT industry. So a lot more focus on making the network truly cloud-based. In 5G, cloud and AI have entered halfway through the process and have been a bit retrofitted onto the network.
Mhm.
So we haven't seen a great deal of sort of scale uptake of, say, virtualized RAN. I think 6G will be inherently cloud-based, and so that changes, obviously, the technology of the network and how it operates. It should make it far more automated, more flexible to support new services. That changes the infrastructure underneath. Where are these data centers going to be that support 6G, very virtualized network? We get back to the idea that popular for a while of having sort of little edge data centers sitting next to a cell tower. You're going to need
Centralized RAN
access.
concept, right?
Exactly.
Mm.
So we may see all of these things, but nothing is set in the stone at the minute. But I think, AI, cloud, support for far more immersive experiences, much improved quality of service, all these are fundamentals. But we also have to say, well, we did kind of say a lot of that about 5G, immersiveness, extended reality, ultra low latency, and generally operators haven't found that many sort of killer applications that really require those capabilities, and certainly that people will pay for.
Yes, and there is this, let's call it spider chart, right? That
Oh,
we
yes.
used to have for 5G, and a lot of the names, ultra latency, massive number of devices connected, are very similar between 5G, 6Gs, and maybe some additional pillars on that spider chart, so it's a bit more evolved, but it looks very similar. Let's
Yeah,
be honest.
I think it is very similar. I think 6G is what 5G hoped to be. I think for 6G to succeed, that's what it's got to be. All the
Mm,
vision that was set out for 5G was perhaps ahead of the time of the technologies that were available to do it, or at least those
mm.
technologies were very expensive. With 6G, some things like sort of an AI RAN, we'd expect by the end of this decade to be affordable for a lot of operators, whereas they're not affordable now. So that's we always have to look at the cost of doing these things. But as always, 6G needs to ensure that its capabilities actually address a market need. That's the really challenge more than the technology.
Let's talk concretely about time frame. Okay, we don't know exactly what it looks like. We started in some ideas what we're trying to achieve, right? When do so if you are a tower core or an operator for what it matters, right? When you need to start planning for it, right? When do you expect capex to start flowing to the market and therefore planning uh, and for planning for it?
Yeah, we'll have the core standards will be set at more at the late 2020s, and obviously there's then a period of time for the chip companies and the equipment companies to build those into what they offer. Although once they have visibility of the specifications, even if they're not completely finalised, they'll start developing that equipment. So it becomes available fairly quickly. But then it's, as you say, how quickly do operators actually adopt it? And I think this will be a difference from previous generations, where almost as soon as it was available, operators felt they had to move to 4G to 5G. I think they'll be a lot more resistant to doing 6G unless they see a proper business case for it. But we'd expect to see really early movers deploying commercially around from 2030, 2031. That will probably be the usual suspects, the operators who are very high tech, differentiate on being ahead of the games. We'll look at operators in Japan, Korea, China, possibly the two big American operators.
Yep. Coming back to towercos, right?
Yes.
So effectively, one of the things we're always observing is there are these ideal take-up curves on new technologies that are typically front-loaded when there is a new generation. But as you correctly suggest, the adoption is actually can be much more gradual because at the end of the day, the customer of the towercos, the operators, have a certain amount of capex budget, right, per year. You can play a bit with that budget, of course, but if you look historically, they have been relatively stable and predictable, right? So some of this adoption actually have been spread over time, and we need to expect that, of course, their grades first happens on existing grid. Therefore, actually might drive a slowdown, right, in densification and additional deploying of additional towers, right, in the initial period as capex is being budgeted for something else. Then we can see an acceleration maybe, but still eating from a relatively fixed budget envelope, unless at some point we find the magic pot and outputs are going up again, right? In beyond CPI, right?
Yes.
Which is not exactly what we're observing, even though there are good signs in that direction. So whenever we do a business plan, a long-term view on the telco, we need to be careful at just suggesting there's going to be 6G, and therefore there's going to be a big immediate upside opportunity in early 20s, right? We need to be careful and understand how this pans out. Now, there is also a question to me about a potential increasing gap between the useful lifetime of active equipment deployed for 5G and actually when 6G will be available, right? Which is something also, it impacts only indirectly tower costs, but it impacts directly MNOs. That's a live discussion we're having with many of them. A base station, there is this rule of thumb, typically which should last, let's say, 8 years. I don't think it's totally true.
No.
In many cases, let's be honest, it can be easily extended to 10 years, right?
Yeah.
But it's 8 years typically from an accounting lifetime, then
Yes,
it can be
absolutely.
extended, right? But there is a potential problem for telcos in terms of to align on when actually 6G equipment, real 6G equipment will be available to deploy on the towers, and actually when they need to start thinking refreshing the 5G equipment, right? And that's certainly a big topic. I don't know, have you been discussion about this with telcos on the research side?
Yeah, definitely. And it is a huge topic. The cycles are becoming very challenging, partly because there's so much more equipment to deploy with, say, 5G than there used to be with 3G. It's much more complicated. And you say each of these elements is coming at some point towards its refresh. And then 6G is coming along. And these cycles don't neatly follow from each other. Operators are trying to extend the life of their equipment, obviously. I think the vendors are responding to that to some extent. A lot of focus also on, can we recycle equipment, reuse it, repurpose it for 6G, not take stuff down every 8 years or even 10. So I think there's a lot of parallel discussions around, can we extend the life of what we've got? And remember, lots of operators are nowhere close to building out all of their 5G yet. Not like 5G's there and it's been sitting up on the towers already for 5 years. It's in the process of being built. So this is quite a difficult thing to align. And I think it will delay 6G for all but the very high-tech operators. I think they'll want to see their 5G refresh cycle. They want to get the most that they can out of what they've got up there for 5G. So unless they can reuse it for 6G or have some kind of single RAN going on, I think there'll be a real reluctance to have two cycles overlapping.
Yeah. And that has an impact on the amount of visits that truck rolls, right,
Yes.
at sites. And of course, then it has implication for how Towerco manage the business and the relation with the operators, right? And we need to see how it's going to evolve. Right? And now, putting into focus now how Towerco really need to focus on 6G and the business case for a Towerco, right? I think the key aspect to be considered and understood is spectrum. And which spectrum band will be deployed and used for 6G, which is going to be, of course, being a portfolio. There's going to be a question which new ones. But I think it's important to explain this podcast why spectrum is relevant. Well, spectrum is probably the core assets of a wireless network, right? Is intangible, but it's very much the infrastructures that links our handsets to the antennas that go on the towers. And the different frequency bands have different propagation characteristics, and therefore dictates how does a grid, mobile grids look like, and therefore how many towers you need in order to support a mobile network. So just to put it in a very simple terms, the lower is the frequency of the spectrum, the further the signal travels, and therefore technically you need fewer sites provide a minimum amount of coverage. On the other hand, the lower you go into the lowest frequency bands, the less spectrum is available, and therefore the amount of spectrum is directly proportional to the amount of capacity that those frequency have, and therefore amount of traffic they can handle. So there is a trade-off, right? In the past, what we've seen is 5G being deployed in the low frequencies for coverage in the 700 megas band, which was in Europe what we call also the second digit dividend, because it was taken out of digital terrestrial television, whereas the key band for the capacity and providing high quality service was the 3.5, right? We actually operator deployed the aforementioned maximum antennas, which by the way, they were not garage doors, just to be clear.
No, that's right.
They were
They're
actually
really quite small now, aren't they?
they're actually very quite small, because interestingly enough, the lower the frequency is actually, because of the law of physics, the bigger it needs to be
Yes.
the antenna, right? So actually the 3.5, just to give, let's talk numbers, right? A low frequency antenna unit, you can approximate it to be 2 meters height, right? Maybe 30 centimeters in width. The maximum antenna, I think, is something like half meter, 70 centimeter high, right? And it's a bit chunkier because much heavier, right? Because you all have the antennas units that I mentioned before that are embedded into it, right? But in reality, they ended up being quite small,
Yes.
right? Heavy, but small.
Sadly for the towercos, but
Sadly for the towercos, absolutely. So effectively, spectrum both dictates about how dense it needs to be agreed for coverage purpose, right? How much capacity is in the network, therefore dictate how dense it need to be the grid in urban areas, but also about how much equipment and how big is the footprint of the equipment that go on a tower. Effective spectrum is the first thing to look at in terms of 6G. Caroline, can you explain us how does this spectrum look like for 6G?
yes. So there'll be a lot of bands that will be possible for 6G, as there are for 5G, but the industry has to sort of converge on a few common bands so that partly so networks can talk to each other, but also so that we get some economies of scale in the equipment. So in terms of new bands for 6G, it's most likely that for the coverage, it will go into 600 megahertz in most markets, down from 700 megahertz 5G. And there are some variations in the Americas, but roughly speaking. And then for the capacity band, between 6 to 7 gigahertz will be like new spectrum. And then early on in 6G conversation, there was a lot of talk about extremely high frequency bands, sub-terahertz, which is really, really tiny range, but very, very high capacity. But we may remember that in 5G, we have the millimeter wave bands, and they haven't been used very extensively. So although towercos have to think, well, what happens if people are using these very tiny cells, short range, huge capacity, where are those cells going? But I think it's probably going to be true in 6G too, that those very, very high frequency bands will not be the main focus. So I think the really important ones are going to be 600 and 6 to 7 gig. In terms of your site grid, there's not too much difference between 600 and 700 in terms of the distance. And especially these days, antennas are much more flexible. They can cope with multiple bands.
Also because
close
you
by.
cannot retrofit a rural network in particular, right?
I-
So what you can think about making a network denser, but
Yes.
making it less dense.
Less dense is no, and there's no need to worry about that. In the 6 to 7, it's very well understood technology because Wi-Fi already uses some bands close to that, but it's a good bit higher up than 3.5, so there will be some differences there. But we do also have to remember that with each generation of antennas, they've managed to get longer range, even on those slightly higher bands. So, for instance, when the 3.5 gig band came in 5G, and there was talk that, people had 2.5 or 2.6 4G wouldn't be able to use the same sites. Well, in fact, yes, the improved technology means that the 3.5 range could be almost as good as the 2.6 was. And so we'll see some of that. So there's less of a big change in the site grid. But the other thing to remember is that there'll be extensive reuse of other bands that have been turned off, e.g. 4G, some 5G bands, technology that allows you to put multiple technologies on the same band now, which used to be very difficult to do. So much more flexibility on spectrum and therefore on the sites that operators listed.
Yeah, I think this point on the 3.5, not necessarily requiring a massively denser grid than the 2.5, 2.6 we use for 4G when we move to 5G. I think is one of the key learnings, right, that we need to take on board, because I've seen way too many business plans, right, predicated on maybe a simplified view on how the technology will evolve. The reality is, I always like joking on the fact that radio access network vendors, they don't work for towercos, they work for operators, right? So
Absolutely.
they have vested interest to optimize networks as opposed to make them kind of inefficient. Otherwise, the equation, right, between capital and revenue on the telco side does not work. And towercos need to realize that. They are one step further down into the technology stack in the value chain. So what does it mean is that because of the beamforming effectively. So before spectrum it was kind of broadcast widely. Given the small antenna unit, right, the beams from the active antennas, actually the signal could be much more focused and travel further, right? It's similar. I kind of really fully understand it the moment I start thinking about the water, right? If you're a water hose, right, you spread it, the water goes at a certain distance. Actually, if you reduce and you make it more focused, right, at the surge, right, it can actually, you have a much stronger jet of water out. And physically is not exactly the same, but to give you an idea of actually the way it's supposed to work. And indeed, also when we think about microwave backhauling, right, we use even higher frequency bands for longer distances. And the concept is the same, is because it's a point-to-point focused beam that follow in this case, between the antennas and the antenna on your handset, which was not the way technology worked before. Probably we can expect even more the same with, I guess, if you start using the 5 or 6 gigahertz bands.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, I think that is right. And I think these bands will be very important to the MNOs, because I think they will allow them to produce that much more focused jet, as you say, but without having to go through the huge disruption of something that's very, very high, like a millimeter, sub-terahertz sort of spectrum. So I think this is, again, an example of 6G not being a dramatic change from 5G. I think focus on trying to make use of what they already have, use the assets that they have, including spectrum, as much as they can.
So let's summarize, right? 6G will create CapEx pressure on operators. So it's gonna probably continue forcing operator to think and invest in their networks on a continuous basis, which is a positive thing for towercos, because they're gonna continue seeing CapEx being spread right into the network. Yes, there will be continuous deployment. It will support continuous deployment, but not necessarily a big acceleration.
Yes, there won't be the big spike that we've seen in the past.
At least not for technology purposes, right? Of course, there could be, because if you think about the spikes we had the last few years, they were maybe more associated with obligation attached to spectrum licenses more than the 5G technology.
Yes. And that's an interesting one where we see, and we have very little visibility on this, but obviously regulators around the world are consulting on 6G and what do they want to use it for in order to fulfill socio-economic requirements and objectives. So it's interesting to see whether we get a lot more conditions attached to spectrum. In certain markets, I think that will be the case. We'll probably realise that they're not going to get the big pot of gold from spectrum auctions in the future that they've had before, partly because operators can reuse spectrum they've got. They're not going to be desperate. But I do think that regulators will be 6G really has to start social and economic change in a way that, again, was discussed about 5G, and there's been really quite a impact. So I think we may see certainly coverage obligations, but also some moving more to sort of quality obligations, which a lot of regulators looking at. And of course, that does affect sites, because if you've really got to guarantee quality, that you're not going to drop calls or go into bad reception, you may need more sites, or you certainly may have sites in different places, or want to move your equipment so that it's more optimally positioned to that maximum coverage.
I really do expect and hope that a lot of these actually, for example, going to have a big focus on transportation access,
Yes.
because I'm pretty sure you're not listening to this podcast unless you have downloaded it, right? If you're on a train in the UK, right? Because that will not be technically feasible, right? Yeah, let alone suburban rates around London, right? So yes, and that's nothing to do with technology, but has more to do. Technology is more the enabler here, right? But the rollout driver there is very much regulation and policymakers' decisions on what they want, right? And probably has not just to do with new bands, but also on the renewal of exit frequency licenses that you mentioned, right? Because it's true that in the UK they actually perpetual, right? But in many other markets, they don't have indefinite license duration, even though this is being debated in Brussels, for example, in Europe. So let's see what's gonna happen there. So that's on the deployment side, right? Of course, the other type of revenue upside you can get for a towerco is on the amount of space. We mentioned it.
Yes.
We kind of inferred it before, right? So what can we expect though in terms of amount of space, the type of antenna configurations that go on the sites?
Yes, quite. I think on those active antennas, I think in terms of weight and size, we are not going to see huge changes. It'll be the same sort of process that we've seen in 5G. It was very noticeable talking to big equipment companies very soon after massive MIMO was sort of becoming adopted, that they switched from differentiating themselves mainly on the performance of their equipment to their headline was always, it's really light. We've got the lightest one, the smallest one, because operators obviously didn't want to be paying the towercos more than they had to. I'm absolutely sure that a lot of the R&D effort on the next generation of those antennas is going the same way. How can we double the performance, same form factor? So I don't really see that as being a big revenue upside. And I think it's more that with these sort of quality obligations that operators just may need more of these active antennas than they currently have.
Of course, I think it all depends on the starting point MSA, so the master service agreement or master lease agreement, depending the contractual form you have between a tower and operators, right? There could be, so we have big benchmarks, right, on these contracts. Given that we reviewed hundreds and hundreds of these contracts. They're all slightly different, but they all have a combination of kind of minimal allowance that the tenants are paying for, which could be defined in terms of amount of space, per footage with loading, or vertical space on the number of antenna units or RAUs, which is the active component that goes on the tower. Depending on how this contract structure, you can have more or less upsides. But this is actually quite linked to some of the other activity, quite few assignment we're getting in consulting, because we're doing a lot of work on the renewal of these contracts. So the towerco industry was born, yes, in the 90s, right? But it really became mainstream probably 15, 20 years ago. And which is kind of the duration of the contracts. Most of these contracts. So actually, we're seeing a lot of these contracts coming up for renewal in the coming years, and both towercos and operators are thinking, right? How should I approach the renewal? And of course, they are divergent interests at stake, right? So it's very important for a towerco to consider new technologies, 6G, whenever they approach the negotiation table, because they're going to be a considerations not about pricing only, but also in terms of commitment for rollout, but also configurations. And this is a lever they can use, right? Depending how well the contract was originally structured. That's a considerations that certainly need to be put on the table in those negotiations. And to be honest, it varies so much depending on the contract, right? That you have. You need really to go back, analyze those contracts, understand if state of the art, understand that it support new technology, yes or not, and based on that, understand what does it mean for your negotiation strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very interesting that, as you say, the renewal of the contracts is sort of coming at the same time as G. It's those cycles are aligning for once, which I think will make it very interesting at the negotiating table, but perhaps will lead to some contracts that really reflect what both sides need to achieve in 6G, because they're needing to think about it at the same time. 5G, the towers were already there, and then the operators had to see if what they needed to change. It was all a little bit messy.
Perfect. We need to talk about adjacencies, new business models, because so
Yes.
far we talked about plain old vanilla macro layer outdoor rollout for mobile networks, right? But in the preparation for this podcast, yes, we prepared it. We just didn't jump on it, right? And we also discussed what does it mean for adjacent business models.
Yes.
You want to talk a bit about it? Where do you see opportunity for towercos beyond, right? New towers and beyond the additional space on existing towers?
Yes, in theory, and I know, we've both been talking to towercos for many years in different contexts about can they extend their model to other types of infrastructure, and we've some towers trying with edge data centers or with sites for small cells like city cells, going in building and looking into the private industrial network market. And in theory, you would think that 6G would sort of enable these models, will accelerate probably operators thinking, yes, we have to build out along roads and rail, said, or inside buildings to get the sort of quality that people expect from E. And the network will be much more cloud-based, so perhaps also moving into data centers that support those networks and the fiber that connects them all would seem a very logical move, that they can have a whole portfolio of infrastructure to offer the operators. And there have been some towercos that have made quite a few efforts in that area, around Castle in Europe. But I feel that you're going to take a skeptical view, because I know we haven't seen those models developing nearly as quickly as perhaps we expected them to in 5G.
No, we need to take, I think, an honest view, right, within the industry about expanding in adjacencies. I've seen many towercos investing a lot of money in those expansions. Lately, I've seen more towercos divesting from these expansions and retrenching in the core business as opposed to invest more money into it, right? Unless we're talking about expansions for financial return, right? As opposed to just simply, let's say, industrial synergies. But at that point, you can make the argument, can this business model and this opportunity be pursued outside the perimeter of the towerco through the shareholders, right? Through a kind of sister company investment or a JV or with a different structure to make sure that the towerco does not distract itself too much from doing a very good job on the core business. So clearly, I look this from the angles of the investors. I work a lot with both towercos and invest on the towercos. And this is where I see a bit of tension between evolving requirements, technically, rationally from the operators, and the obvious, therefore, push on the towercos to kind of expand the perimeter to follow the customers, right? Which is what you're suggesting. Honestly, operationally, strategically makes a lot of sense to me. Conflicts in many situations with the financial interest of, because one way I always like saying that the towerco business model is almost the perfect business model for a low cost of capital investor, right? Infra, pension funds is very great business model, and every adjacent expansion does not have the same infra-like characteristic. Not infra-like, but core infra characteristics that a towerco business has. And therefore, this has an implication on the cash flow profile of these adjacencies, the technology cycle, right, of these adjacencies. And therefore, it might not resonate with the investment criteria of the investors that are currently backing these towercos. We need to sort out this kind of conflict, right? Because that's one of the reasons some of these expansions have not succeeded.
Yes.
Because there is an internal conflict.
Yes, absolutely. And then that has an impact on the MNOs also wanting to expand their business model and thinking we need more cells in certain areas. We actually want to do railway services, for instance, but they can't find an efficient sort of infrastructure partner. They're having to deal with all these different little companies who own certain sites. And of course, they want the towerco model for its scale and its efficiency. So somewhere, maybe 6G will help these two worlds to line better.
Yes, I also see the opposite, right? In some cases, I see operators willing to actually diversify the supplier base, right? Out of the towercos having some specialized companies doing, providing some services. And honestly, the world is not black or white, right? We can think about kind of financial and organizational structure where potentially these adjacencies are addressed a special vehicle where towercos take role and supported by different pockets of capitals, right? It's definitely something that needs to be considered if you want to, as an industry, to harness full the potential of new technologies.
Yes, absolutely. And in the end, that will be what 6G has to deliver for all these groups and for the infrastructure companies, for the operators. Don't believe that either of these sets of stakeholders are going to do a huge expansion on spec. Hope that it generates business. I think 6G is going to be very high returns for both sides.
I think that it's a good time to take a pause, right? And maybe summarize some of the key findings of these discussions, right? From my point of view is 6G is not there yet, but we start having enough indication about how it could look like in order to start taking educated guess. What does it mean for towercos? It does rollout is probably more dictated by policymaker decisions and the CapEx constraints of the operator as opposed to the evolution of the technology. 6G will be a positive factor, but not necessarily a game changer. Right, so we're gonna see a bit more business as usual deployment if it weren't for maybe some externality like associated to quality of service obligation more than well coverage. In terms of equipment, there is an opportunity potential for towercos, but it depends a lot on the existing contracts that are up for renegotiations. So towercos really need to develop a robust negotiation strategy that take into account 6G. They cannot forget about 6G. They need to develop understanding now, today, about what 6G means for them into the negotiation table. And yes, we have not fully tapped the opportunity of expansion and adjacency, right? And we need to probably formulate better strategies if towercos want to really explore this opportunity without conflicting with the amazing margins they have, right? And
Yes.
the CapEx profiles that they have. So this is all to be investigated.
Definitely, I think it's an excellent summary, Ali. I'd say one more thing to towercos. I think operators are going to be looking for their infrastructure partners to be real partners in the whole business going into 6G. So I think it's going to be driven by commercial and policy considerations, as you say, not by technology, even though the technology advanced quite a lot. So actually, things like the location sites and will perhaps be more important than technology going on. I think this should be very much a two-way conversation and a partnership going forward. It hasn't always been the case in the past. Starting to see their big towercos as genuine business partners who can help them address the big challenges that will come with making 6G strong business case. Not there yet with that, but with the cycle of renewals of contracts, good time to perhaps become more intertwined with others' business.
In other words, I think you suggest towercos listen to your customers
Yes,
proactively.
Right? Absolutely.
We should all do the same. Okay, great.
Great. Well, I think that's a nice note to end on.
Thank you all for listening.
Yes, thank you everyone for listening. And look out for more content that we will have coming on this subject. This is just to start, really. Ali, I think we've got a paper going to be published fairly soon.
Yes, there is a presentation that me, Caroline, and the rest of the team, I mean, credit to them, right?
Oh, yes,
they did a lot of good work that is going to be available. Free content, actually. Very good content that's going to be available on the website. You just need to register and download it. A lot of content we didn't touch on today because we went massively off track, as we like.
Yes.
And we look forward to receiving your comments, and feel free to reach out if you want to expand your understanding of 6G and what does it mean for your business and your investment case. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Have a good day.